autumn fog hung heavily over Raven's Hollow, a small, picturesque village that had recently gained notoriety for a crime that even the most experienced investigators found impossible to explain. The story of the disappearance of Arthur. Werner, the village's beloved local historian, had turned the sleepy hamlet into a place of speculation and dread. Werner, a man in his early 60s with a penchant for detail, had been an eccentric character, with a life that seemed more like an unending collection of neatly bound chapters rather than a man's personal history. Yet, in the midst of an ordinary evening, his disappearance left the village breathless and uneasy. The evening of the incident had been no different from any other, the sky bruised with the fading light of day, and the streets of Raven's Hollow quiet, except for the occasional crackle of a fire. Arthur Werner had dined at the local pub with a small group of friends, discussing his latest project on the village's history. As the clock struck 8, he left for his home on the edge of the village, the same path he had walked for decades. The heavy fog, however, had made the journey eerie, as though the very air conspired to swallow him whole. His house was not far, an old, ivy-covered stone building that creaked and groaned with the weight of its years. It was there that the mystery truly began. When his neighbour, Mrs. Collingwood, saw the candle flickering through his window well past midnight, she grew concerned. It was unlike Arthur to stay up so late, especially alone. She decided to check in on him, but when she arrived, the house was eerily quiet, the door unlocked, and the inside cold. The most peculiar thing about the situation, however, was the note on the mantel. It was a single sheet of paper bearing only one word: eclipse. No other context, no sign of struggle, and no trace of Arthur anywhere in the house. The room appeared undisturbed. His belongings were still in their places, the fire long, extinguished in the hearth, and his favourite armchair facing the window, as if waiting for someone. There was no evidence of foul play, but the disappearance was impossible to ignore. The village constable, a well-meaning but inexperienced man named Albert Quinn, could make no sense of it. The note only added to the confusion, offering no explanation, but a cryptic message. The local press was quick to seize upon the story, calling it a riddle no one could solve. Theories abounded. Perhaps he had simply wandered off, or been taken by someone with a strange agenda. Yet, all the while, the fog lingered, obscuring any truth. Arthur Werner's disappearance was a puzzle that no one could piece together. This point, Miss Jane Marple arrived in Raven's Hollow. Known for her keen observation and unrivaled ability to see through the most intricate of mysteries, she was summoned by an old friend of hers, Mrs. Collingwood, who had always appreciated Miss Marple's insight into human nature. The moment she set foot in the village, Miss Marple was acutely aware that something in the air had shifted, as if the very landscape itself was holding its breath. The first thing Miss Marple did was visit the Werner household. The scene was, as described, a locked door, a cold room, and the mysterious note. The absence of struggle told her one important thing. Whoever had been involved was either known to Arthur or was someone who could gain access without arousing suspicion. But the note, eclipse, was a riddle that stuck in her mind. What did it mean? It seemed out of place in a world where Arthur had never shown any particular interest in celestial events. And yet, there it was, leading her thoughts down a path she knew she had to follow. She asked Mrs. Collingwood about any recent changes in Arthur's life. The neighbour mentioned that Arthur had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He'd spent more time alone, his papers scattered across the house in disarray, as though he were piecing together something of great importance. He'd even spoken about an old manuscript he had found in the village archives, something that had been hidden for generations. But it was too late to ask him what it all meant. Miss Marple's next step was to visit the archives themselves, a small, dusty room at the back of the town hall. The village historian, Mr. Beck, was there, a quiet man with an air of secrecy that Miss Marple found intriguing. She spoke to him about Arthur's recent obsession with the manuscript, and though Mr. Beck tried to seem nonchalant, Miss Marple noticed his nervous shift. He quickly grew defensive when asked about the document, claiming that it was just a collection of old, irrelevant records. But something about the way he spoke told her that there was more to it. "Are you sure there's nothing of value in that manuscript, Mr. Beck?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm and measured. He hesitated before answering. "I'm sure. It's just another collection of rumours. Arthur was a dreamer, always chasing after things that weren't there." But Miss Marple had a feeling that this was no mere coincidence. Arthur had been on the cusp of something, and the manuscript, despite Mr. Beck's dismissal, seemed to be at the heart of it. When she returned to the Verner house, Miss Marple focused her attention on the small details, things that most would overlook. There were faint marks on the floor near the mantel, as though something heavy had been moved recently. She also found a partially torn envelope, its contents missing, hidden behind a loose brick in the wall. It was addressed to someone named Reginald, a name she hadn't heard before in connection with Arthur. Reginald, the name echoed in her mind. Miss Marple knew this was the breakthrough she needed. She spent the next few days digging into the history of Arthur Verner, searching for any mention of a Reginald. It was only after examining some old letters in the village archives that she discovered the truth. Reginald was none other than Arthur's long-lost brother, a man thought to have vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly now. She returned to the house, focused on the note, the manuscript and the strange disappearance. It was all connected. Arthur had found something in the manuscript, something that had led him to the discovery of his brother's fate, and now that very knowledge had put him in danger. The name Eclipse was not a random word, but a coded reference to a time, a date, the precise moment when Reginald had disappeared all those years ago. And it was at that very moment Miss Marple realized that Arthur had met the same fate as his brother. The riddle was solved. Arthur Verner hadn't simply vanished. He had been taken, as his brother had been before him. The crime was not an isolated incident, but the conclusion of a much older story, one that Miss Marple had unravelled with quiet precision. In the end, the truth came to light, and Raven's Hollow was left to wonder how such a strange history had played out in their midst. As the fog rolled in heavier the following morning, Miss Marple took her time at the Verner household, examining every room, every piece of furniture, every inconsequential detail that might have escaped the notice of the authorities. Constable Quinn had already completed his investigation, relying on routine procedures, his reports devoid of anything particularly noteworthy. Yet there was something that stuck with Miss Marple, an unsettling feeling that the truth had been lingering just beneath the surface, concealed by the mundane distractions that had kept the investigation from progressing. The constable had spoken at length about his findings, describing how the door to the house had been unlocked, with no signs of forced entry. The furniture had been neatly arranged, and there had been no obvious traces of a struggle. Arthur's overcoat had been left hanging by the door untouched. On the surface it appeared as though Arthur had simply vanished into thin air. But Miss Marple knew better. This wasn't the kind of crime that could be solved by simply checking off boxes on a list of standard procedures. She focused on the minutiae, the small, seemingly insignificant details that others might ignore. She started in the living room, slowly running her fingers over the mantel where the cryptic note had been found. The paper had been folded precisely, yet there was something off about it. As she unfolded it again, she noticed faint marks on the edges, as though it had been folded and unfolded many times. Arthur had likely read the note several times before he disappeared, trying to decipher its meaning. Turning her attention to the rest of the room, she looked at the position of the furniture. Everything appeared in order. But it was the rug that caught her eye. There was a subtle indentation near the edge, just enough to suggest that something had been moved recently. Perhaps a chair had been pushed back, or something had been placed and then quickly removed. Whatever it was a trace of something that hadn't been there before. Miss Marple bent down, carefully lifting the rug. Beneath it, she discovered a small metal object, an old-fashioned key, tarnished with age, yet clearly significant. The key was nothing like the ones used to open doors in the house. It was ornate, with intricate engravings, and it had a strange weight to it. Miss Marple examined it closely, wondering what it might unlock. She tucked it into her pocket, promising herself she would investigate it further later. For now, the mystery was far from over, and the key was just one piece of the puzzle. As she continued her search, she felt the familiar sensation of someone watching her. She turned, finding herself face to face with Mr. Beck, the village historian. His presence had been oddly timed. He had shown up at the house as soon as Miss Marple began her examination, offering a curt nod before standing in the doorway. "I see you've found something interesting," he remarked with a faint smile, though there was an unmistakable tension in his posture. He didn't step into the room but stood just outside, as if reluctant to enter. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, straightening up. "A key. But I wonder, Mr. Beck, if you have any idea what it might unlock." Beck's eyes flickered nervously, but he quickly composed himself. "I'm not sure. It could belong to one of Arthur's many old trunks. He was always so particular about keeping his things locked away." Miss Marple studied his face for a moment, noting the subtle shift in his expression. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to raise her suspicions. She had learned long ago to trust these instinctive impressions. The historian had known something more, something he wasn't willing to share. "Arthur's trunks, you say?" she asked, her voice measured but sharp. "I didn't realize he had so many. Do you happen to know where he kept them?" Beck's smile faltered, and for the briefest moment, Miss Marple could see the weight of something hidden behind his eyes. "He kept most of them upstairs, I believe," he said, though the hesitation lingered. "But you should ask Mrs. Collingwood about those. She was always in and out of Arthur's house." Miss Marple nodded, but she could tell he was brushing her off. He didn't want to talk about the trunks, and she was certain they held a secret. Beck was hiding something. She decided to leave him for now, but she made a mental note to follow up on his vague answer. The next step was to visit Mrs. Collingwood, whose familiarity with Arthur might provide the insight Miss Marple needed. The elderly woman had been the one to discover the disappearance, and her statement was as straightforward as it was unhelpful. She had seen nothing unusual the evening before, and as far as she knew, Arthur had been perfectly normal. But Miss Marple felt certain there was more to the story, and she would need to press Mrs. Collingwood further. When Miss Marple arrived at Mrs. Collingwood's home, she found the older woman sitting in a chair by the window, her eyes fixed on the foggy street outside. She greeted Miss Marple with a kind smile, but seemed distracted, her thoughts elsewhere. "I'm sorry to trouble you again, Mrs. Collingwood," Miss Marple began gently, "but I'd like to ask you about the night Arthur disappeared. You mentioned seeing the light in his window late at night. Was there anything unusual about that?" Mrs. Collingwood nodded slowly, her brow furrowing as she seemed to recall the evening. "Well, now that you mention it, there was one thing. I saw someone leave the house. Just for a moment, but it was there, I'm sure of it. A shadow moving past the window." "A shadow?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward. "Could you describe this person?" Mrs. Collingwood shook her head, looking puzzled. "No, not clearly. It was just a shape. But it was fast, like someone was in a hurry. It didn't seem to belong to Arthur, though. He was much slower on his feet." Miss Marple's mind raced as she processed this new information. Someone had left the house that night, a shadow moving quickly, a figure that wasn't Arthur. Could this be the answer? Had someone taken him? She asked Mrs. Collingwood about any other visitors Arthur might have had recently, but the woman was unable to provide any further details. However, Miss Marple had gathered enough. The missing man had been taken by someone else, and she was now certain that the key she had found was tied to this very person. The investigation was taking shape, but there was still so much left to uncover. It was time to return to the house once more, this time with a new determination. The pieces were slowly coming together, but the full picture remained hidden, like a puzzle with too many corners and too few clues. Yet Miss Marple had a way of finding connections that others missed, and the truth, she was certain, was about to be revealed. The wind had picked up by the time Miss Marple returned to the Verner household, the fog now thickening into a heavy, suffocating mist. It seemed as though the weather itself was conspiring to obscure the truth, just as the villagers had done for days. There was something unsettling about the way people were reacting to the investigation, an eagerness to help, but in a way that seemed too rehearsed, too insistent. As Miss Marple moved through the house once more, her mind worked on the contradictions she had uncovered. A shadow in the window, a key left hidden, vague recollections from witnesses. There was more to this than met the eye. Her first stop that afternoon was to meet with the constable. Quinn, though well-meaning, had been struggling with the complexities of the case. His reports were always precise, but they lacked insight, a fundamental understanding of the human motives behind the crime. Miss Marple, in contrast, had been focusing on the people involved. Each one she encountered seemed to offer a version of events that felt like a carefully crafted piece of a larger puzzle, except they were all slightly different, and that's what intrigued her most. Constable Quinn greeted her with his usual air of professionalism, though his eyes were tired. "I've been speaking with the locals again, Miss Marple," he said, flipping through his notebook. "Everyone seems so willing to cooperate, a little too willing, if you ask me." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but sharp with observation. "What have they told you?" Quinn looked uneasy as he thumbed through his notes. "There's been no shortage of stories. Mrs. Collingwood swears she saw someone leaving the house the night Arthur disappeared, though she couldn't say who. Mr. Beck claims he hasn't seen anything unusual, but I don't know, something doesn't feel right with him. It's all just a lot of noise, but nothing concrete. That's the problem, Miss Marple murmured, looking around the room. It's as though the facts are being buried beneath too many voices. She had already gathered that Mrs. Collingwood's account was vague at best, but her statement about seeing someone leaving the house seemed to hint at something more. She decided it was time to speak with the historian, Mr. Beck, in greater detail. His reluctance the other day to discuss the manuscript had only intensified her suspicion that he was hiding something significant. Leaving Quinn with his thoughts, Miss Marple made her way to Beck's home. It was a small, neat cottage on the edge of the village, its stone walls covered with creeping ivy. When she knocked, the door opened almost immediately, revealing the thin, sharp face of Mr. Beck. He seemed surprised, but not entirely unwilling to entertain her visit. "Miss Marple," he greeted, though his voice was tinged with uncertainty. "What brings you to my humble abode?" "I was hoping you could clarify a few things for me, Mr. Beck," Miss Marple replied, her tone polite but firm. "There's something that's been bothering me about our last conversation." Beck hesitated, but gestured for her to come inside. "Of course, if it's a matter of Arthur's disappearance, I'll do whatever I can to help." As they sat, Miss Marple could sense the nervous energy around him, as if he were trying to maintain control of a conversation that was slipping from his grasp. She wasted no time in addressing the crux of the matter. "You said Arthur had been obsessed with an old manuscript," Miss Marple began, watching Beck's face closely, "but you were rather dismissive of its significance. Why is that?" Beck's eyes darted to the side, as though searching for a way out. He shifted in his chair, clearing his throat. "Well, it's just a collection of local history. Nothing too important. Arthur was always one for chasing after wild theories, you know." "Wild theories?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice calm but her eyes sharp. "You seem to have a very specific recollection of Arthur's interests, Mr. Beck. It's curious, really. I've spoken to several people, and none of them have mentioned this manuscript in the same way you have." Beck flinched slightly. It was a small movement, but one that Miss Marple noticed. "Perhaps I've made too much of it," he said quickly, his words too eager to dismiss the topic. "It's just that Arthur always had a tendency to get, well, obsessed with his research. He would sometimes get lost in it to the point of ignoring everything else." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her gaze never leaving him. "But I believe it's more than that. You see, when you speak of Arthur's research, you sound almost defensive." Beck's face tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he let out a small, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple, but I don't know what you're getting at. Arthur was a brilliant man, but he had his quirks." Miss Marple's mind was already running through the possible motivations. Beck's evasiveness was a clear sign of discomfort. There was something more to the manuscript, something he didn't want her to find. She smiled faintly, sensing that she had him on the back foot. "Of course," she said. "But sometimes, Mr. Beck, when people are trying to hide something, they become very eager to brush it off. And that eagerness tells me there's something important. That's being concealed. What are you hiding, Mr. Beck?" Beck's composure cracked for a moment. "I'm not hiding anything," he insisted, his voice too sharp. I just don't want this small village to be dragged into something bigger than it is." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly, her gaze narrowing. "So you're concerned about something larger than the village, then?" He didn't respond immediately, and Miss Marple could see the panic rising in his eyes. She knew she had struck a nerve. "What do you mean, Mr. Beck? What's bigger than this?" He looked at her then, as if trying to weigh his options. And for a long moment, Miss Marple thought he might break down completely. But instead he stood up, his expression hardening. "I've said enough," Beck snapped. "You've no reason to suspect me. If you're so keen on solving this, perhaps you should ask Mrs. Collingwood what she really saw that night." Miss Marple stood slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "I intend to do that," she said quietly. "But I won't stop until I find the truth, Mr. Beck. And I have a feeling you know more than you're letting on." With that, she turned and left the cottage, the weight of the encounter pressing on her mind. There was a sense of deception hanging in the air, something that felt increasingly personal, as though the village itself were holding a secret. Miss Marple knew she was getting closer to the heart of the mystery. Every contradiction, every nervous glance, every word carefully chosen, all were pieces of a puzzle that would soon be solved. The truth was buried beneath layers of fear. But Miss Marple would uncover it, no matter how deep it had been hidden. As Miss Marple left Mr. Beck's cottage, a sense of quiet urgency settled over her. The historian had clearly been hiding something, but his evasiveness only served to deepen the mystery rather than clarify it. He wasn't the only one with secrets. The tangled web of motives was becoming clearer, but the more she uncovered, the more complex everything seemed. There were too many moving parts, too many people who might have had something to gain from Arthur Verner's disappearance. Her first stop the next morning was Mrs. Collingwood. The elderly woman had seemed harmless, her statements vague but consistent, but Miss Marple now suspected that her role in the events might be more significant than it appeared. The strange detail about the shadow at the window had remained in Miss Marple's mind, the faintest hint that something or someone had been hidden from view. Mrs. Collingwood had spoken of Arthur's late-night activities without much thought, but there was a reason why she had been so careful to avoid any more concrete details. Had she been protecting someone? When Miss Marple arrived at the Collingwood household, she found Mrs. Collingwood seated at her usual spot by the fire. The woman's face softened when she saw the detective, but her eyes remained cautious, as though anticipating the conversation. "Miss Marple, I do hope you've come to find some answers," she said, her voice a soft murmur that seemed more resigned than hopeful. "I have come to ask more questions, Mrs. Collingwood," Miss Marple replied, her tone polite but firm. "Your statement has stuck with me, particularly about the shadow you saw leaving Arthur's house that night." Mrs. Collingwood looked uncomfortable at the mention of it, her hands twitching in her lap. "I already told you everything I saw. It was just a shadow, and I didn't think much of it at the time. But now, with all this fuss about Arthur, I wonder if I missed something." "You didn't miss anything," Miss Marple said carefully. "But perhaps you were not the only one who saw that shadow." The older woman stiffened, her eyes flicking toward the door as though searching for an escape. "I don't know what you mean," she murmured, but Miss Marple could hear the nervous tremor in her voice. "I believe someone was in Arthur's life, more than you are letting on," Miss Marple continued, stepping closer. "Someone who might have had a reason to be there that night. Someone who may have been involved in his disappearance." Mrs. Collingwood's eyes darted to the window, her lips pressed tightly together. Then, in a sudden motion, she stood up. "You're wrong. I don't know what you think you're implying, but I can't help you." "I'm not implying anything, Mrs. Collingwood," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but insistent. "But I do need you to understand that your hesitation speaks volumes. There's more here, and if you know something, now is the time to tell me." The silence stretched, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the woman's reluctance. But just as it seemed as though the conversation was about to reach a standstill, Mrs. Collingwood spoke in a low whisper. "It wasn't just a shadow," she said, almost to herself. "There was someone in Arthur's house that night, but it wasn't who you think." Miss Marple leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "Who was it?" But Mrs. Collingwood shook her head, a faint shudder running through her. "I can't say," she whispered. "I just know they weren't supposed to be there. I couldn't see their face clearly. But their presence, well, it felt wrong." Miss Marple knew there was more to this. Mrs. Collingwood was terrified, and it wasn't the usual fear of gossip. Something was deeper, more personal. But for now, Miss Marple had to leave it at that. She had learned enough to know that this new development, the mysterious figure who had been present that night, could be the key to unlocking the rest of the mystery. The next person to speak with was Arthur's business partner, John Hargrove. A man in his mid-50s, Hargrove had always seemed trustworthy, the type who kept a steady hand on the tiller of their joint enterprise. Yet there was something cold about the way he spoke of Arthur's disappearance, as though he was simply following the necessary protocol, but detached from the personal loss. Hargrove had arrived in town the day after the disappearance, just in time to join the search, but something about his alibi had struck Miss Marple as odd. He had been away on business the night Arthur had vanished, or so he claimed. But it was too convenient, too clean. No one had been able to verify his whereabouts with certainty. When Miss Marple arrived at Hargrove's office, she found him standing by the window, staring out at the village. He turned when she entered, offering a stiff smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone formal but polite. "I assume you've come to speak about Arthur." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, her gaze fixed on him. "I'd like to hear more about your whereabouts the night of his disappearance." Hargrove stiffened but quickly masked his discomfort with a forced smile. "I've already given my statement to the constable. I was away on business, as I told him." "Yes, I've read your statement," Miss Marple said, stepping closer. "But I wonder if you could help clarify something. You were out of town, but no, one seems to have been able to confirm your exact location during the crucial hours that night." "Can you tell me more?" Hargrove shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "I don't see how it's relevant. I had no reason to be involved in Arthur's disappearance." "Of course not," Miss Marple said smoothly, watching his every move. "But you must understand why it would be important to confirm your movements, given that Arthur's disappearance was so sudden." Hargrove's gaze faltered, but he quickly regained his composure. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I'm not hiding anything. I'm concerned about what's happened to my friend, just like everyone else." The words were rehearsed, and Miss Marple could tell he was trying too hard to sound convincing. She had seen it before. People who were guilty, or at least hiding something, often became too eager to over-explain. She gave him a slight smile. "I don't believe you, Mr. Hargrove," she said, her voice low but firm. "And I think you know more than you're telling me." He froze at her words, and for the briefest of moments, his composure slipped, revealing a flicker of panic in his eyes. But just as quickly, it was gone. He cleared his throat, his voice now cold. "I have no time for games, Miss Marple. You're wasting your time." And just like that, the door to Hargrove's office seemed to close on the possibility of a deeper conversation. Miss Marple felt the pieces falling into place. Hargrove had a motive, whether it was greed, jealousy, or fear, and his alibi was as slippery as the fog outside. But even with him, she still couldn't see the whole picture. Back at the Verner house, Miss Marple sat alone in the drawing room, reviewing the growing collection of evidence. Every person involved in this case had a motive, but the pieces weren't fitting together. She suspected that Beck knew more than he had let on, that Mrs. Collingwood was hiding something, and that Hargrove's alibi was little more than a smokescreen. Yet none of these motives alone explained everything. The web of deception was growing tighter. Miss Marple could feel the answer just within her grasp, but the complexity of it all made her pause. She needed to uncover the threads that bound these people together, to find the key that would unlock the full story. And with every conversation, she felt closer to finding the truth. But the question remained: who stood to gain the most from Arthur Verner's disappearance? Only when that was answered would the case finally be solved. Miss Marple sat in the drawing room of the Verner household, the weight of her thoughts pressing on her like the dense fog outside. The pieces were coming together, but still, there was something elusive about it all, something she couldn't quite place. The interviews, the contradictory statements, the nervous glances, they all seemed to be pointing toward the same conclusion, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being led astray. It was late afternoon when Constable Quinn arrived, his steps brisk as he crossed the threshold, a sense of urgency in his manner. He held a folded piece of paper in his hand, his face a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Miss Marple's instincts immediately went on alert. The constable's eagerness often spelled trouble, for it meant he had jumped to a conclusion, without considering the finer details. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice full of anticipation, "you won't believe what we've found. We've just uncovered something that may finally solve the case." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, but she remained outwardly calm. "What have you found, Constable?" He placed the paper on the table in front of her. "It's a letter, an unsigned letter, but it's clearly connected to Arthur's disappearance. It was hidden in his study, tucked away in a drawer. The letter mentions someone named R. Arthur seemed to have been trying to gather information about them, perhaps in relation to his research or something else." Miss Marple looked at the letter carefully, noting the paper's weight, the ink's consistency. It was hurriedly written, the words scrawled in a jagged, nervous hand. The contents were unsettling. The letter seemed to suggest a threat, or at least a warning, aimed at Arthur. "You're in too deep," it read. "Leave this alone, or the consequences will be dire. R." For a moment, Miss Marple allowed the implications of the letter to settle in. If this R was a person, they were clearly connected to the mysterious events surrounding Arthur's disappearance. It was a lead, a thread to pull, and it felt promising. Yet something about it didn't sit right with her. The letter was too convenient, too obvious. It was the kind of discovery that felt like a piece, too perfectly cut to fit into the puzzle. "The constable and I are certain this is a breakthrough," Quinn said, unable to hide his satisfaction. "With this letter we have a clear motive. Someone wanted to silence Arthur. We just need to track down this R." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind already working over the details. "And what about the rest of the evidence? Have we corroborated this with anyone who might know of this R?" Quinn shook his head. "Not yet. But we've got a lead, Miss Marple. That's all we need to move forward." Despite the constable's optimism, Miss Marple couldn't shake the nagging feeling that they were missing something crucial. She leaned over the letter, inspecting the paper again. It had been hidden well enough to be found only now, which suggested someone had been careful. But why would the person who had left it behind allow it to be discovered at all? The criminal didn't want to be caught. They wouldn't have left such an obvious clue in the first place. "I'm not so sure," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet, but firm. "This letter feels too perfect, too easily discovered." Quinn frowned. "What do you mean?" "I think it's been placed here deliberately," Miss Marple continued, her mind racing through the possibilities. "Either the person who wrote this is trying to mislead us, or they're using it as a red herring, to get us to chase the wrong lead. But it's about R," Quinn insisted. "It's a clear connection to the case. We're close, Miss Marple. I can feel it." Miss Marple paused, looking at the constable with a thoughtful expression. She wasn't dismissing his excitement, but she wasn't about to let the investigation slip into premature conclusions. "I understand your eagerness, Constable, but I've seen this before. People make mistakes when they get too caught up in what they want to believe." The constable looked frustrated, but Miss Marple could see he was also beginning to doubt his own conclusions. She knew that doubt had to be confronted, not ignored. "Do you mind if I keep this for a while longer?" she asked, gently folding the letter and slipping it into her bag. "I'll need to think on it. In the meantime, I believe it's time we revisit the other suspects. There's still too much we don't know about their movements, their motivations. I don't think this letter tells us everything." Quinn hesitated but eventually agreed, his disappointment lingering in his eyes. As Miss Marple left the Verner house, her mind was already turning over the new information. She had an instinct. Something was off about this letter. It was too easy, too tidy. A mere distraction, or perhaps something meant to send her down the wrong path. That evening, Miss Marple met with Mrs. Collingwood once more. The older woman was more subdued this time, the earlier spark of fear now replaced by something closer to resignation. She greeted Miss Marple without the same unease. "I didn't want to say more before," Mrs. Collingwood said softly, "but I think you're right. I think I know who R might be." Miss Marple's attention sharpened immediately. "Who, Mrs. Collingwood?" The elderly woman glanced around as if to ensure no one was listening. "I've heard whispers around the village, Miss Marple. There's a man, though he's more of a shadow now, who might be connected to all this. His name is Roger Sutherland. He was close to Arthur once, but no one has seen him in years." Miss Marple's pulse quickened at the name. "Roger Sutherland. What happened to him? Why has he disappeared?" Mrs. Collingwood shook her head. "I don't know the full story, but there were rumours about a falling out. Something about money. Arthur was going to expose him for some shady dealings, but then Roger just disappeared. Some said he left town. Others think he was involved in something darker. I don't know for certain, but if anyone was behind—" "What happened to Arthur? It's him." The connection made sense, at least on the surface. A man with a history of shady dealings, a falling out with Arthur, and now the mention of his name in the letter. But Miss Marple's mind was still reeling from the thought of the letter itself. It wasn't that the lead didn't have merit. It did. But there was something about the timing, about the way the evidence was falling into place, that suggested she was only seeing part of the picture. The real truth was still lurking, hidden in the shadows. The next day, the authorities were in full swing, combing through Roger Sutherland's old haunts. But Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that they were moving too quickly. The case was beginning to feel too solved, too neat, and that was always a sign that something vital was being overlooked. As the day wore on, she sat by the fire at the Werner house, her thoughts tangled. She had a feeling that the breakthrough they believed they had found wasn't a victory at all. It was a false one, designed to lead them astray. She was closer than ever to the truth, but the real criminal, the true mastermind behind Arthur's disappearance, was still in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And Miss Marple would be ready when that moment came. The following days passed in a blur of frantic activity. Constable Quinn, despite Miss Marple's doubts, had pressed forward with his theory about Roger Sutherland. They found his old apartment, a small, run-down building on the outskirts of Raven's Hollow, but it was abandoned. It seemed too obvious, too easy. Sutherland's name was now being mentioned in every conversation, his shadow looming larger with every step the authorities took. The village was buzzing with rumours, yet Miss Marple remained unsettled. Everything was moving too quickly, and it wasn't just the case, it was the very people involved. She could feel that she was being misled. It wasn't until she was visiting her friend Miss Turner in the village library that an old, forgotten case came back to her. Miss Turner was an astute librarian, a woman of many books and many memories. When Miss Marple had asked her for access to any records about the village's past, the librarian had been more than eager to assist. Among the dusty shelves, Miss Marple had discovered a collection of newspaper clippings that mentioned Arthur, Werner's involvement in an unsolved case from several years earlier. It was an old story that had been all but forgotten. The case had involved a series of robberies that had rattled Raven's Hollow nearly 2 decades ago. The stolen goods had been antiques, priceless heirlooms that were meant to be sold on the black market. But there had been no arrests, no suspects. The police had made little headway, and the case had gone cold. At the time, Arthur Werner had been one of the few who had been asked to investigate the matter due to his background in history and his knowledge of antique collections. As Miss Marple flipped through the brittle pages of the article, a name caught her eye: Roger Sutherland. He had been mentioned briefly in the report as a potential witness, but no one had ever pursued the lead. Back then, Sutherland had been involved in various shady dealings, but no one had ever been able to connect him directly to the robberies. The police had assumed he was just another opportunistic hustler who had been near the scene, but had no real ties to the crimes. But now, the significance of that name couldn't be ignored. It clicked with the recent findings. Sutherland wasn't just a former acquaintance of Arthur's, or a disgruntled business partner. He was part of a long-buried story that Arthur had been actively involved in solving. Miss Marple felt a sudden surge of clarity as the pieces began to fall into place. She met with Constable Quinn again, this time under the quiet shade of the oak tree outside the constable's office. He had been running himself ragged in the search for Sutherland, but Miss Marple could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "Constable," Miss Marple began, handing him the newspaper clippings she had found. "There's something from the past we've overlooked." Quinn glanced at the headline, his brow furrowing as he read. "I don't see the connection, Miss Marple. A robbery from years ago? What does that have to do with Arthur's disappearance?" Miss Marple looked at him with patient eyes. "Everything. Arthur was involved in this case. He had been investigating it, trying to uncover the truth behind the antiques heists. Sutherland's name appears here, and though he wasn't implicated, he was certainly present at the time. What if he's been hiding something all these years?" Quinn shook his head, clearly frustrated. "You think Sutherland's been involved?" in these robberies all along, but why would he suddenly— That's just it, Miss Marple interrupted gently. He didn't suddenly reappear. This isn't new. Arthur was digging into something deeper than anyone realized. What if this case from the past, this robbery, was part of a larger web? What if it was connected to something or someone more? Recent, Quinn paused, thinking about her words, but his skepticism was palpable. And you think Arthur's disappearance is part of that web? How does that explain everything else? Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice low. There are too many coincidences in this case, Constable. The letter we found, R, and the history with Sutherland. Everything points back to a connection between the two events. It's possible that Arthur uncovered something dangerous, something that made him a threat. If that's true, we've been looking at the wrong person all along. Constable Quinn remained silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the ground as he absorbed her words. It was clear he was still uncertain, but Miss Marple could see the seed of doubt beginning to take root. "Where should we start looking?" he finally asked, a note of reluctant agreement in his voice. "Start by finding those who were involved in the original robbery. Talk to anyone who might have known Sutherland back then, who might remember what happened. The truth isn't just buried in the present, it's anchored in the past. It's possible that someone from that time is involved now, using old connections to cover their tracks." Quinn nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. As he turned to leave, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted back to the robbery case. It had been a botched job, a failed scheme by an ambitious group of thieves. But what if it hadn't been entirely random? What if the robbery was part of a larger plan that had remained unfinished? The more Miss Marple pondered the connections, the more she realized that the events of the past hadn't been closed. They had simply been waiting, dormant, until someone like Arthur Werner had stirred them back to life. But who could have been watching, waiting for Arthur to uncover their secrets? She didn't have the answer yet, but she knew that the past wasn't just a shadow over the case, it was the key to understanding what had really happened to Arthur. And somewhere, buried deep within the tangled history of Raven's Hollow, the truth was waiting to be uncovered. Her next stop was a place she had barely considered, the old estate of Horace Collingwood. Mrs. Collingwood had mentioned that her husband had been involved in dealings with the antiques, though his involvement had never been directly tied to the robberies. But Miss Marple had learned over the years that when the past and present collided, no detail was too insignificant. If Collingwood had been involved in the past thefts, he might hold the final clue to unraveling this mystery. As Miss Marple made her way to the estate, the weight of the years seemed to press against her, the forgotten connections whispering from the past, tugging at the present. She could feel the shadows of those who had long since gone, pulling the strings of the present without ever being seen. But Miss Marple was no stranger to such shadows. She knew that to catch them, you had to look not only where the light shone, but where the darkness lingered. And now, in the dim recesses of Raven's Hollow, the shadows were about to give up their secrets. Miss Marple walked the winding path leading to Horace Collingwood's estate, her mind sharp and focused on the puzzle that was gradually taking shape. She'd been thinking about the old robbery case and the way it intertwined with Arthur Werner's research. If the pieces were falling into place, then surely someone close to the case was hiding something, and that something was exactly what Miss Marple was determined to uncover. Collingwood's estate, set against the backdrop of a sprawling garden, seemed to stand in stark contrast to the suspicion brewing in Miss Marple's mind. The house itself had been built with a stately elegance that spoke of generations of wealth. Yet there was something about it now, an air of neglect around the edges, as though its owners had stopped paying attention to its upkeep long ago. Miss Marple approached the front door, resolved to speak with Collingwood himself, despite his wife's earlier evasiveness. She needed to know more about the man's past, about his involvement with the antiques that had been the focal point of the unsolved robberies years ago. When the door opened, it was not Collingwood himself who greeted her, but a younger man, tall with an angular face, dressed in dark clothes. His eyes lingered on Miss Marple for a moment longer than necessary before he spoke. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "I'm here to see Mr. Collingwood," she said simply, her voice calm and unassuming. "I'm conducting a little inquiry about some old business." The young man's eyes flickered with something, perhaps surprise, perhaps uncertainty, but he stepped aside. "Please come in. My father's expecting you." Miss Marple entered the house with measured steps, her senses heightened. The interior of the home was meticulously arranged, though it felt oddly sterile, as though its owners had never fully inhabited it. Everything seemed pristine, but not lived in, an unsettling calm permeating the place. Horace Collingwood, an older man with a sharp gaze, sat in a chair by the fireplace, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Despite the warmth of the room, his expression remained cool, almost too composed. As Miss Marple took a seat across from him, she studied him closely. There was an air of calculation about him, a feeling that he was always evaluating, always watching. "I understand you've been involved in some of the antiques that have been circulating through Raven's Hollow," Miss Marple began, her voice casual but laced with an underlying edge of inquiry. "I'm investigating a matter related to the Verner family, specifically the strange disappearance of Arthur Verner." Collingwood's expression didn't change, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of his jaw. "Arthur Verner was an acquaintance of mine, a good man, though perhaps too focused on his research for his own good." "And what was his research?" "Focused on?" Miss Marple asked, her gaze unyielding. "I understand it involved some of the antiques in the area, particularly those that were stolen years ago." Horace Collingwood's eyes darkened at the mention of the stolen antiques. He paused for a moment, considering the question before answering in a measured tone. Arthur had a certain fascination with the past. He thought he could uncover connections that others had missed. "The robberies." He stopped, his voice tightening for a moment. "Those are old wounds. There's nothing to gain by reopening them." Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone soft but probing. "But surely, Mr. Collingwood, you can see why the past might still be relevant. Arthur had been investigating something connected to the thefts, and it's been suggested that you may have some knowledge about it." For the first time, a crack appeared in Collingwood's carefully composed demeanour. His fingers twitched, a barely noticeable movement, but it was enough. It was the kind of gesture that someone who had practiced restraint would instinctively make when they thought they were being pushed too hard. "Listen, Miss Marple," he said after a moment, his voice taking on an almost parental tone. "I'm not the one you need to be investigating. You've already wasted enough time on things that don't matter." Miss Marple's eyes never left his. "Perhaps, Mr. Collingwood, but I've learned in my experience that even small details are worth examining, especially when they're buried deep." The older man met her gaze, and for a split second something flickered in his eyes. A recognition, perhaps, or a trace of guilt. He cleared his throat, sitting a little straighter in his chair. "I've no patience for these games, Miss Marple. If you're trying to make something out of nothing, I suggest you leave." Miss Marple smiled softly, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't play games, Mr. Collingwood. I merely ask questions, and it's those who avoid answering them that often have the most to hide." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple could feel the tension shift in the room. It was a subtle change, but it was there. Collingwood's composure was cracking, ever so slightly. She had struck a nerve, and she could tell that he was beginning to feel the pressure. The crack had appeared, and now she had to widen it. "Tell me, Mr. Collingwood," Miss Marple continued, her voice low and deliberate. "Do you remember the name Roger Sutherland?" The name seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His eyes widened imperceptibly. His hand, which had been resting on the arm of the chair, shifted. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied quickly. But there was a slight tremor in his voice that Miss Marple did not miss. "Roger Sutherland was involved in the robbery of antiques," Miss Marple said, her voice even, though she was watching him closely. "And he's been connected to some rather unsavory dealings. Perhaps you remember him from years ago." Collingwood's lips pressed together in a tight line. He leaned back in his chair, visibly trying to compose himself. "It's ancient history. Why do you persist with these questions? There's nothing for you to find here." But Miss Marple knew better than to take his words at face value. She had already seen the signs. His quick reaction to the name, the slight tremor in his voice, the way his body had stiffened. It was as if he had just been reminded of a part of his past that he had hoped would remain forgotten. "I think there is something for me to find, Mr. Collingwood," Miss Marple said, her voice gaining in authority. "And I think you know exactly where to find it." The older man's expression tightened, but he held his ground. He had underestimated Miss Marple, thinking that his smooth, practiced demeanour would keep him safe. But it was in that crack, that moment of vulnerability, that Miss Marple had caught him. "I've been asking the right questions," she continued, "and sooner or later I'll find the answers. The past doesn't stay buried, Mr. Collingwood. It has a way of resurfacing when least expected." Horace Collingwood's face remained stone cold, but in his eyes Miss Marple could see the struggle. The crack was there, and now it was only a matter of time before the truth would pour through it. As she stood to leave, she felt the heavy weight of his gaze on her back. The game was changing, and Miss Marple knew she was no longer just a passive observer. The investigation had shifted, and the elusive truth was now a little bit closer, tucked away in the shadows of the past, waiting to be uncovered. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows across the grounds of the Collingwood estate as Miss Marple made her way back to the village. The encounter with Horace Collingwood had left her with a sense of urgency she could not shake. His evasive manner, the cracks in his composure, there was something deeply troubling about him, something she was not yet able to fully grasp. But the name Roger Sutherland, the old robbery case, and Collingwood's unmistakable reaction told her that she was inching closer to the truth. As she neared the village, she turned over in her mind everything she had learned so far. The investigation into Arthur Verner's disappearance was beginning to converge on the Collingwoods, but it wasn't clear how they fit into the larger picture. If the robberies were connected to Arthur's research, why had he been silenced? What, in the end, had he uncovered? That evening Miss Marple sat alone in her small cottage, reviewing her notes by the glow of a dim lamp. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Constable Quinn, looking weary, but there was an edge to his expression, something that told Miss Marple that he was carrying important news. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with you," Quinn said, his voice low and urgent as he stepped inside. "There's been a development. Something's gone wrong." Miss Marple's heart sank. "What is it?" "The evidence, some of the crucial documents we had from the Verner case, they've gone missing, destroyed, or maybe taken. We don't know yet. But whoever did it, they're trying to bury the truth before we can get to it." Miss Marple frowned, her mind racing. "Who could have done this?" "We don't know, but I'm certain it's not a coincidence. We were on the right track, and now someone's working against us. It's all been tampered with. Files are gone, pages torn out of reports. It's as though someone knew exactly what we were looking for." Quinn paused, his gaze hardening. "I think we've been too close to the truth, Miss Marple. And someone doesn't want it coming out." She stood, feeling the familiar surge of determination. This isn't the first time the evidence has been manipulated, and it won't be the last. Whoever's behind this knows exactly how to cover their tracks. Quinn's frustration was palpable. "It's maddening. We've been making progress, but now we're back at square one, and we don't even know who's pulling the strings." Miss Marple gave him a thoughtful look, her mind already working through the possibilities. "I believe we're dealing with someone who has a very personal stake in this, someone who knows the history of these antiques, and more importantly, who knows the power they hold." The constable nodded, but there was a note of doubt in his voice. "But who?" "Everyone we've talked to so far has either denied knowing anything or has been too frightened to say anything useful." "I think we need to go back to the beginning," Miss Marple said quietly. "The past is always present in a case like this, and someone doesn't want the past uncovered. We need to find out what's being hidden, why Arthur Verner's research was so important and what it all leads to." With that, Miss Marple took her coat from the hook by the door. "Come, Constable, we've work to do. This isn't over yet." The pair set out in the fading light, heading toward the village archive, where the original records from the robbery case were stored. Miss Marple had a hunch. The documents that had been tampered with weren't the only source of information they needed. The original case files stored in the old town hall were just as crucial, but now it seemed they too were at risk. As they entered the dimly lit archive, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the missing documents. Who would have had access to them? And more importantly, who would benefit from their destruction? She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trying to erase something from the past that had the potential to unravel everything. They found the town hall locked, its windows dark. Miss Marple reached into her bag, pulling out the key to the archive, a key she had borrowed from the librarian who had always been accommodating. She inserted it into the lock and turned. The door creaked open and they stepped inside. The archive was silent, rows of dusty files lining the shelves. It smelled of age and neglect, but Miss Marple's focus was razor-sharp. She immediately moved toward the back, where the old records of the robbery were stored. The room felt colder than it had a few days ago. The air was heavy with the sense of something being wrong. As they sifted through the files, a new sense of unease settled over Miss Marple. It was subtle, but she couldn't ignore it. The unmistakable feeling that something wasn't quite right. She scanned the documents in front of her, comparing them to the lists she'd seen earlier. One by one, she checked the files against the notes she had taken from the records, but there was a missing file, an important one. "Constable," she said slowly, her voice tense. "There's a file gone missing, the one on Sutherland, the file detailing his movements during the time of the robberies. It's not here." Quinn's face paled. "That file was in the box just this morning. I saw it myself." Miss Marple's mind raced. "Then someone has taken it, or destroyed it. This wasn't an accident." They searched the room thoroughly, checking every nook and cranny, but it was clear. The file was gone. A cold shiver ran down Miss Marple's spine. Whoever was behind the theft of the evidence was very careful, very deliberate. This wasn't just a case of trying to obscure one piece of the puzzle. This was an active attempt to destroy the investigation entirely. "It's clear now," Miss Marple murmured, looking at Quinn. "We're not just dealing with one criminal. We're dealing with someone who's willing to do anything to prevent the truth from coming out." As they exited the archive, the weight of the stolen evidence pressed heavily on Miss Marple's shoulders. The stakes had just escalated. Whoever was behind this knew how to cover their tracks and was working tirelessly to bury the past. But Miss Marple had learned over the years that no matter how deep one tried to bury the truth, it always found a way to resurface. And now, Miss Marple was more determined than ever to ensure that it did. The following morning, as Miss Marple made her way back to the village with Constable Quinn, a cold breeze swept through the streets, carrying with it the faint scent of the sea. It was the kind of morning that should have felt peaceful, but instead, an oppressive sense of unease hung over the town. The stolen file and the disappearance of crucial evidence had raised the stakes of the investigation. But as they approached the constable's office, they were met with a sight that made their stomachs drop. There were two officers standing in front of the door, their faces grim. Quinn's footsteps faltered, and he stopped beside Miss Marple, his expression darkening. "What happened?" Miss Marple asked quietly. One of the officers, a young man named Porter, looked at them with a mix of confusion and worry. "Miss Marple, Constable, it's terrible. Mrs. Judith Collingwood. She's been found, murdered." The words hit like a blow to the chest. Miss Marple's mind raced, sorting through the tangled threads of the case. Mrs. Judith Collingwood, the wife of Horace Collingwood, who had been acting so strangely the day before. Judith had always been a rather unassuming woman, with no apparent ties to the crimes or the robberies. But now she was dead. "What happened?" Quinn asked, his voice taut with disbelief. "The body was found in the stables," Porter continued, swallowing hard. "It looks like she was struck over the head. We don't know much yet, but it was clearly deliberate." Miss Marple's mind immediately shifted. This wasn't just another murder. It was a message. A message meant for them. She could feel the weight of the situation settling over her like a suffocating fog. Whoever was behind this, they had just escalated everything. They weren't just trying to cover up the past. They were ensuring that the truth would remain buried. "No matter the cost. I'll need to see the body," Miss Marple said firmly. Quinn looked at her, his concern evident, but he nodded. The constable had learned long ago that when Miss Marple spoke with such quiet certainty, it was best to follow her lead. The stables were on the outskirts of the Collingwood estate, a sombre and silent place where the horses were kept, away from the main house. The moment Miss Marple stepped inside, she felt the chill in the air. It was as if the entire area had been cloaked in a sense of dread, as if the walls themselves were trying to hold the terror at bay. The body of Judith Collingwood was laid out on the ground, her face pale, her body stiff from the rigor of death. She had been struck with a heavy object. The blow to her skull, so forceful, it had left a wound that was both brutal and final. Her once pristine appearance was marred by the dirt and blood that stained her clothes. But there was one detail that immediately caught Miss Marple's eye. Despite the violence of the attack, there was something almost deliberate about the positioning of Judith's body. It was as though the killer had taken care to place her just so, ensuring she was found in a particular manner. Miss Marple leaned closer, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. It wasn't just the body that was out of place, it was the surroundings. The stables were otherwise untouched, nothing else disturbed. Yet there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, a disquieting calm, as though someone had been here recently and had left without a trace. "Is anything missing?" Miss Marple asked, quietly, turning to the officer who had been standing at the entrance. Porter hesitated. "We haven't had time to fully investigate yet, but nothing seems to be out of place in the immediate area." Miss Marple nodded, stepping back as she studied the body for a moment longer. "I think the killer meant to send a message with this murder, intended it to be a warning." "But to whom?" Quinn asked, his voice laced with uncertainty. "Mrs. Collingwood wasn't involved in any of this as far as we know." "That's just it, Constable," Miss Marple said softly. "She wasn't involved, not directly. But this was a crime meant to create a ripple effect, to unsettle those who are already looking too closely. The murderer wanted us to see that no one is safe." Her thoughts whirred in the silence that followed. If Judith Collingwood had been killed to send a message, it only meant one thing. The villain was still very much in control of the situation. The disappearance of Arthur Werner, the missing evidence, the lies and deceptions, it was all part of a much larger game. The murderer was still several steps ahead of them, manipulating every piece to suit their own design. Miss Marple felt a strange, deepening sense of resolve. The investigation had taken a dark turn, but it wasn't over yet. Whoever was behind these killings, these calculated moves, was not beyond her reach. She could feel the threads tightening, all leading to a single, inevitable conclusion. The question now was not just who was behind the crimes, but why they were willing to go to such extremes to stop the truth from coming out. But for now, the immediate question was how to prevent the next tragedy. The game had changed, and Miss Marple knew that if she wasn't careful, the next victim could be her, or anyone else who had gotten too close to the truth. "We need to act quickly," she said, her voice steady. "We cannot allow this to spiral any further. Whoever is behind this, they are running out of time. But so are we." As they left the stables, the weight of the tragedy pressing heavily on her, Miss Marple felt the subtle shift in the air around them. The clock was ticking. There was no more time to waste. The days following Judith Collingwood's murder were a blur of grief and confusion. The village had descended into a state of unease, with people whispering in hushed tones about the tragedy. No one seemed quite able to put it all together. Even the constable, usually so steady and reliable, had begun to show the strain of the case. Miss Marple, however, refused to let herself be swallowed by the chaos. Instead, she focused, unwaveringly, on the smallest details, trusting that the answers lay not in the obvious, but in what had been overlooked. She returned to the scene of Judith's death, hoping that a fresh perspective would offer something new. The stables, though still solemn with the shadows of tragedy, were quieter now, the bustle of the investigation having subsided somewhat. The officers had completed their initial search, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes swept the area with meticulous care. This time she focused on what had been left untouched, the details that others might have missed in their haste to uncover the killer's identity. As she walked among the stalls, a thought suddenly struck her. Judith Collingwood had always been a woman of routine. She would have been the first to notice if something was amiss, especially in a place she knew well, like the stables. And yet, there was no sign of struggle, no overturned objects. It was almost as if she had been lured here and made to feel comfortable before the fatal blow was struck. Miss Marple bent down, her fingers brushing against a small, almost inconspicuous piece of fabric caught on a nail in one of the stalls. It was too soft to be the usual stable cloth, and as she examined it closely, she realized it wasn't a piece of clothing at all. It was a scrap of paper, crumpled, folded, and torn as though it had been discarded hastily. She picked it up, carefully, her heart pounding as she unfolded it. The paper held nothing but a single line of text. "Don't let the past catch up with you." The words were simple, yet laden with ominous intent. It was a warning, Miss Marple realized. One that linked back to the very heart of the case, the past. That was the key to it all. The robberies, Arthur Verner's disappearance, the secrets hidden within the Collingwood family. Everything was tied to something buried, something no one wanted to confront. Judith Collingwood had likely known this, and her death had been the price of uncovering it. As she stood there, the message in her hand, a shiver ran through her. It wasn't just a random remark, it was a deliberate hint, carefully placed for her to find. Whoever had killed Judith Collingwood had anticipated her every move, and now they were actively trying to keep her from uncovering the truth. The real question was, why? What had Judith discovered that was so dangerous? And why had someone been willing to kill to keep it hidden? Turning the paper over, Miss Marple noted the faintest mark on the back. It was barely noticeable, but under the light, she could just make out a small indentation. She pressed the paper against the back of her notebook, revealing the outline of what appeared to be a name she recognized. The initials were faint, but unmistakable. R.S. Roger Sutherland, the man whose name had cropped up repeatedly throughout the investigation, the man who had once been part of the robbery ring that had plagued the estate all those years ago. And now, it seemed, he was connected to Judith's murder. Miss Marple's mind raced as she pieced the information together. Judith Collingwood had been a part of something far bigger than anyone had realized. She had known about the old robberies, but not just the robberies. There had been something hidden, something valuable, something worth killing for. She hurried back to the constable's office, where Quinn was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands. The exhaustion in his eyes was clear, but when he looked up and saw her, something shifted. Miss Marple was no stranger to the weight of a difficult case, and her determination was always enough to spark something in Quinn. He knew that, when she was this focused, there was always a breakthrough coming. "Constable," she said briskly, setting the paper down on his desk, "I think we've just discovered something that changes everything." Quinn frowned as he picked up the paper. "What's this?" "A clue," Miss Marple replied simply. "The key to the case has been in plain sight all along. You've been looking at the robberies, at the people involved, but you missed the Most important detail. Roger Sutherland is not just some distant figure from the past. He's at the center of it all. Quinn raised an eyebrow. Sutherland? But he's been out of the picture for years. I thought... Exactly, Miss Marple interrupted. We thought he was out of the picture, but someone has been keeping that past alive. They've been hiding something valuable. And it's all tied to what Arthur Werner was researching. Judith Collingwood must have stumbled onto it, which is why she was murdered. Quinn was quiet for a moment as he processed the information. But why would Sutherland, someone who's supposed to be in the past, be involved now? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with clarity. Because the past has never really gone away. And Sutherland isn't the only one hiding something. There are others who will go to great lengths to keep this buried. Quinn stood abruptly, his hands on his hips. So, what do we do now? We find out what's being hidden, Constable, Miss Marple said, her voice low but determined. The pattern is beginning to take shape, but we're still missing the final pieces, and I believe soon enough we'll uncover exactly what's at stake. As she left the constable's office, the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fall into place one by one. Judith's death had been more than just a random act of violence. It was a calculated strike meant to bury the truth, to keep the past from catching up with those who were determined to protect it. And now, Miss Marple was more certain than ever that she was on the right path. The killer had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated her. She had already begun to connect the dots, and with each new revelation, the truth was beginning to rise to the surface. It was only a matter of time before she would expose the conspiracy that had been hiding in plain sight for so long. As Miss Marple made her way to the small, cluttered study in the Collingwood estate, she felt the familiar tightening of focus, the sharpening of every sense that had come to define her approach to crime-solving. It wasn't just about finding the facts anymore. It was about understanding the people who created them, the minds that shaped their motives. And as she considered the developments of the past few days, one name kept resurfacing: Roger Sutherland. But there was something more, something deeper, that had yet to be revealed, a motive that none of them had considered. Judith's death had been a catalyst, but it wasn't the root of it. No, the true reason, the real drive behind the murder, was buried in the shadows of history, just as the victim's involvement with the long-forgotten robberies had been. Miss Marple had spoken, with many of the people involved each offering their own fractured perspective on the crime. They all had their reasons: greed, jealousy, even fear, but none of them had fully explained what drove the killer to this extreme. But now, with everything aligning, she had come to understand. It was only when she revisited a conversation with Margaret Denby, the housekeeper, that the final piece fell into place. Margaret had been strangely quiet when Miss Marple had asked her about Judith's relationship with Roger Sutherland. She had refused to speak at first, her face pale, her hands trembling. That was the moment Miss Marple had suspected something, far more personal than a mere robbery, was at play. And now, as she sat at the desk, sifting through old letters in the estate's library, she found it, an old photograph hidden beneath a pile of correspondence. It was a black and white image, dated more than 2 decades ago. The faces were faded, but there was no mistaking the young woman in the center, Judith Collingwood. But standing beside her, almost hidden in the background, was none other than Roger Sutherland. The two of them were smiling, arms around each other, in a photograph that didn't look like one taken among criminals or victims. It was a moment of familiarity, of something deeper. Judith had known Roger long before the criminal activities had come into the picture. The photograph held the key, revealing the intricate connection between the two. Miss Marple's mind began to form the outline of a story, one that involved more than money, more than revenge, or even greed. There had been a love affair, hidden from the public eye, one that had ended tragically years ago. Judith, it seemed, had loved Roger once, but she had left him after he was arrested and his criminal past had come to light. He had been consumed by bitterness ever since, and Judith had distanced herself, eventually marrying someone else, someone far wealthier and more stable. But Sutherland's obsession had never truly ended. He had spent years in the shadows, watching, waiting for the right time to strike. And now, with Judith uncovering old secrets, with the past threatening to resurface, he had seen his opportunity, not just to get revenge on the woman who had rejected him, but to prove to himself that he could control her fate even from the shadows. This was no longer about stolen treasures or old debts. It was about possession, about reclaiming something lost. Miss Marple stood up, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk. She could almost hear Sutherland's voice in her mind, each word filled with that twisted sense of entitlement. "You think you can escape the past, Judith? You think you can walk away from what we were?" It all clicked into place. The motive wasn't just about any treasure or material gain. It was about Roger Sutherland's need to possess Judith once more, even if it meant silencing her forever. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She turned and saw Constable Quinn standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I think it's time we speak with Sutherland," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "You were right to suspect him, but the truth goes beyond simple motives of money and theft. This is something far more personal." Quinn stepped into the room, his brow furrowed. "So it's him, then? He's the one behind it all?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, but it's not just that he's the murderer. It's why he did it. This was never about robbery or retribution. This was about possession, and about proving something that has haunted him for years." Quinn still seemed unconvinced. "But how can we be sure? I mean, we don't have anything solid, no physical evidence that links him directly to the crime." Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "You're right, Constable. But we don't need physical evidence for this. We need to understand the psychology at play. Sutherland's need to control the past, to force Judith back into his life, drove him to murder. It was not just a crime, it was an obsession." The constable nodded slowly, but Miss Marple could see the gears turning in his mind. He hadn't quite connected all the dots yet, but he was close. "Let's go and confront him," Miss Marple said. "I believe he's still here in the village. And when we speak to him, he'll finally show his true colours." They left the study together, the weight of what was about to happen settling over them like an impending storm. The pieces of the puzzle were all there now, unmistakable, irrefutable, and as they made their way to Roger Sutherland's last known location, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Judith Collingwood. She had been far more than a victim of circumstance. She had been a woman tangled in a web of love, betrayal, and regret, and ultimately she had paid the price for her own attempt to escape the ghosts of her past. But now, Miss Marple was determined to bring those ghosts to light, and with them, the truth that had been hidden for so long. In the shadow of the Collingwood estate, under the weight of the history that lingered between the walls, the final confrontation awaited. and with it, the revelation of a truth far darker than anyone had anticipated. The cold air of the late afternoon wrapped around Miss Marple and Constable Quinn as they approached the crumbling stone facade of the old inn where Roger Sutherland had been hiding for the last few days. The small, almost unnoticeable building sat at the edge of the village, isolated from the town's centre, but still within reach of those who wished to stay out of sight. Its windows were dark, the shutters drawn. It looked abandoned, yet Miss Marple knew better than to trust appearances. Quinn's steps were slow, heavy with the weight of the investigation, but Miss Marple moved with her usual calm, deliberate pace. Her mind was clear now, and though the tension of the moment wrapped tight around her chest, she wasn't about to let it show. The pieces were all in place. All the threads of this twisted web had come together in one final decisive moment. It was time to end this, once and for all. She stopped at the threshold of the inn's front door, glancing back at Quinn, who was still a few steps behind her. He had his hand on the gun at his side, his eyes darting nervously around the small, narrow street. Miss Marple could tell that the constable was still unsure about the outcome of what they were about to face. She, on the other hand, was certain. "Stay close, but don't rush it," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to let him feel trapped." Quinn nodded, but his face betrayed his hesitation. Miss Marple's sharp gaze lingered on him for a moment before she turned back to the door. With a steady hand she pushed it open, and the faint creak of the hinges echoed through the empty building. Inside, the inn was cold and dimly lit, its walls cloaked in the same sense of abandonment that Miss Marple had expected. The smell of old wood, musty and stale, filled the air. There was no one in sight. They moved cautiously through the hall, checking each room in turn, finding them all empty. Miss Marple's heart beat steadily, but her mind was alert, tracking every possible sound, every shift in the atmosphere. She was waiting for the smallest of movements, the telltale sign that Roger Sutherland was watching them, waiting for his chance to strike or to flee. At the far end of the hall, they reached the kitchen. Miss Marple paused, motioning for Quinn to hold back for a moment as she stepped forward. There in the farthest corner she saw the man she had been hunting. Roger Sutherland. He stood by the stove, his back to them, a pot of tea simmering on the fire. He was still, almost eerily calm, and yet there was a palpable sense of danger in the air. Miss Marple could almost feel the tension crawling beneath his skin, the twitch of his fingers betraying his desire to do something, anything, to regain control. She stepped into the room, her gaze never leaving him. "It's over, Roger," she said quietly, her voice soft but firm. He didn't turn to face her immediately. His silence was deafening. When he did finally face her, his eyes were cold, calculated, and for the first time in days, Miss Marple saw a flicker of fear behind his stoic expression. "You should have stayed away, Miss Marple," he said, his voice low but smooth. "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight the moment Judith Collingwood died," Miss Marple replied, her gaze unyielding, "and it became something much more when I realized you had been lying to all of us. The truth about your connection to her and to everything that followed was never about money. It was always about her. You never stopped wanting her." Sutherland's lip curled into a bitter smile. "You think you know everything, don't you? But you're wrong. You have no idea what I've gone through, what she did to me. There's nothing you can say that will change the truth." Miss Marple said, moving closer, her voice unwavering. You killed her, not because of a theft, but because you couldn't bear the thought of her walking away from you. Sutherland's eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched. For a moment it seemed as though he might lash out, perhaps even try to escape. But Miss Marple was ready. She had known what he was capable of from the very beginning. And now, in this moment, it was her turn to push him into a corner, to make him face the consequences of his own actions. Your obsession with her drove you to murder, she continued, her tone now sharp, like the cutting edge of a blade. You never let go. You wanted control, even after all these years. You thought you could silence her, and then you thought you could get away with it. Sutherland took a step back, his eyes wild with desperation. You don't understand. She never loved me like I loved her. I couldn't let her ruin everything. I couldn't let her tell them, expose me for what I truly am. There's nothing left to expose, Roger, Miss Marple replied, her voice steady. You've already shown us who you are, and now you'll face the consequences. His expression faltered for a moment, a split second of doubt. But it was all Miss Marple needed. The tension in the room grew unbearable as Quinn moved forward, his gun drawn. But it wasn't the threat of force that had stopped Roger. It was the realization that the truth had come to light. He was caught. There was no way out. For a long, tense moment, Sutherland stood frozen, his back to the wall. Then, with a swift, angry motion, he lunged for a knife on the nearby counter. But before he could reach it, Miss Marple was already a step ahead. She had expected this, had predicted his reaction, and with a single, calculated movement, she stepped forward, disarming him in one smooth motion. Enough, Roger, she said, her voice cold now, as if the fight had already been won. The game is over. Sutherland's breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling with rage and fear. You don't know what she did to me, he spat, his eyes wild. You don't understand. I understand more than you think, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm and resolute. I understand that you're broken, but no matter how much you try to justify it, murder is still murder, and you will answer for what you've done. With that, the final pieces of the puzzle snapped into place. The truth was undeniable now. Roger Sutherland was no longer a man driven by a desire for revenge or stolen riches. He was a man consumed by a love twisted into obsession, a love that had pushed him to extremes. But now, as the constable stepped forward and handcuffed him, Miss Marple knew that justice would finally be served. It was over. As the constable secured Roger Sutherland's wrists with the handcuffs, Miss Marple stood still, her gaze fixed on him, her mind working in a quiet rhythm. The tension in the air had dissipated somewhat, but a lingering feeling tugged at her. A whisper in the back of her mind that something wasn't quite as finished as it seemed. Sutherland was no longer a threat. He would answer for his actions, and justice would be served. Yet as she surveyed the room, her thoughts took another turn, threading back through the case, back through the tiny details that she had held so close. The pieces had fit together perfectly, hadn't they? The murder of Judith Collingwood, the obsession, the deceit, the rage. It had all made sense. And yet something wasn't quite right. Roger Sutherland was caught, but something else had started to bother her, a subtle, unnoticed movement beneath the surface. Quinn, his face weary and stiff with the effort of the arrest, glanced up from his task of checking Sutherland's pockets. It's over, Miss Marple, he said, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "We've got him. The confession, everything. It all matches." She gave him a half nod, her gaze still drifting over the room. It was dim now, the evening light fading, as shadows stretched across the stone floors. The inn had never felt more desolate, more haunted by the ghosts of secrets long buried. And yet, there was something here that didn't sit right. She turned to face Sutherland, who had gone quiet. Now, the defiance draining from him. His eyes darted around the room, but he said nothing, his silence almost a confession in itself. But Miss Marple knew better than to take his word as final. He wasn't the only player in this game. Suddenly, a noise, soft, almost imperceptible, broke the silence. It was a movement from the back of the room, an almost imperceptible shuffle that made Miss Marple's pulse quicken. She turned sharply, eyes narrowing as they landed on a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Miss Marple recognized her immediately. It was Clara, the young maid who had worked for Judith Collingwood at the manor. Clara's eyes darted nervously between Miss Marple and the constable, then to Sutherland, who even in his defeated state stiffened at the sight of her. She was out of breath, as if she had been running. Miss Marple. "You have to listen," Clara said, her voice trembling. And it was then that Miss Marple knew. The weight of this revelation hit her like a heavy stone. There was something more here. Clara stepped forward cautiously, wringing her hands together. I didn't want to say anything before, not until now, but I—" She stopped, as if unsure how to continue. The tension in the room shifted, a ripple of unease passing through it. "There's something you don't know. Something you've missed." Miss Marple raised a brow, the edge of her intuition sharp as ever. The young woman had been too quiet, too reserved during the entire investigation. Miss Marple had assumed. Her fear was rooted in something unrelated. She had been wrong. "What is it, Clara?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady. I was the one who helped him," Clara admitted, the words falling from her lips like stones dropped into a deep. "Well, I was the one who helped Roger after he killed Judith." There was a long, pregnant silence as Miss Marple's mind raced. The constable looked as though he might ask Clara to repeat herself, but Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. She needed to hear more. "What do you mean? Helped him?" Miss Marple asked, keeping her tone neutral, though her mind was already spiraling. "How did you help him?" "I didn't want to. I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't want to," Clara stammered, her voice breaking. "But he threatened me. He said he'd ruin me if I didn't. He said he knew what I had done, that I had been the one who—" Her voice trailed off, and Miss Marple felt a wave of realization wash over her. Sutherland had known something more. There had been more to Clara's involvement than she had realized. He said he would expose the secret, the one from years ago, if I didn't help him clean up the mess, Clara whispered, her hands trembling. "I didn't know what to do. He made me help him move Judith's body. He made me lie. And when the police came, I didn't know how to stop it. I just couldn't. He made me too afraid." Miss Marple's mind sharpened as she pieced the new information together. Clara's fear, her silence, it all made sense now. The maid had known something about Sutherland, something that gave him power over her, something that explained why she had stayed silent, why she had allowed herself to be swept along in the deception. The secret. Miss Marple said quietly, her voice soft but heavy with implication. "You're not talking about Judith, are you?" Clara's eyes flicked to Sutherland for just a moment before looking back down at her hands. "No," she whispered. "It was about her husband, Charles Collingwood." Miss Marple felt the floor beneath her shift. Charles Collingwood had been a well-respected man in the village, but his death a few years ago had never been fully explained. It had been ruled as a tragic accident, a fall from the cliffs near his estate. Yet now, as Clara's words hung in the air, Miss Marple saw the shadow of a deeper conspiracy stretching back years. Clara's eyes filled with unshed tears. "Charles didn't die from an accident, Miss Marple. Roger. He killed him. And I—" Her breath hitched. "I helped cover it up." The realization hit like a thunderclap. The pieces had never just been about Judith. This was much, much bigger. Roger Sutherland had murdered Charles Collingwood, and Judith had found out. She had confronted him, and that confrontation had sealed her fate. But Clara had been part of it all. She had helped hide the truth of Charles's death, allowing Roger to continue his manipulation of the people around him. The case had never been just about Judith. It had been about something far older, far more insidious, a truth buried beneath layers of lies, fear, and manipulation. For a moment, the weight of this final revelation nearly took Miss Marple's breath away. Everything had led to this. Everything had been part of the same dark, twisted scheme. And now, with Clara's confession, the truth was clear. The case was far from over. It was just beginning. With a slow, measured glance at the constable, Miss Marple turned back to Roger, her eyes hardening. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The weight of Clara's confession hung in the air like a dense fog, suffocating everything in its path. Roger Sutherland stood frozen, his face ashen, his hands still bound, but his posture now completely devoid of any defiance. It was clear that he had been caught in his lies, caught in his web of manipulation. But Miss Marple knew that the truth, while damning, had yet to bring closure. The final strands of the puzzle needed to be woven together, and the room was still thick with the tension of untold secrets. Clara, her face pale and tear-streaked, stood trembling in the corner. She had made her confession, but her voice was fragile, as though she feared the weight of the truth might crush her entirely. She had admitted to being complicit in both the murder of Charles Collingwood and the cover-up of Judith's murder. Yet, despite her admissions, Miss Marple's sharp mind was still calculating the hidden pieces of this twisted tale. "You've told us everything, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice calm and reassuring as she moved toward the maid. "But there's still something that needs to be understood. Something else you haven't yet said." Clara looked up, her eyes desperate. "What do you mean, Miss Marple? I've told you everything I know." "No, you haven't," Miss Marple replied, her gaze unwavering. "You've told us what you've been forced to say, but there's something deeper, isn't there? There's more to this than just the murders. You and Roger, why are you still so afraid? Why are you protecting someone else?" Clara's mouth trembled, but before she could speak, Roger Sutherland gave a sharp, bitter laugh. "You think I'm the only one behind all this, don't you? That I'm the mastermind? You're wrong. There's more at play here, and you've all been too blind to see it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This was the moment. The final piece of the puzzle had just been pushed into place. She had known there had to be more. This was never just about greed or revenge. Roger Sutherland, though guilty of many things, was not the true architect of the chaos that had unfolded. Turning back to Clara, Miss Marple said softly, "You weren't just threatened by Roger, were you? He didn't force you into this out of simple malice. You had your reasons for complying, didn't you? Your silence, your fear. It wasn't just for him. It was for someone else entirely." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, and she wiped at them furiously. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. Miss Marple's piercing gaze never wavered, and finally Clara collapsed, her voice breaking with despair. "Julian," she whispered, her words barely audible, yet they hit Miss Marple with the force of a revelation. "It was Julian. I couldn't tell you, Miss Marple. I couldn't. He's the one pulling the strings, not Roger. Roger was just his pawn. He made us all do what we did." "Julian?" Quinn's voice was incredulous, and even Miss Marple had to take a second to absorb the name. Julian Collingwood, Judith's younger brother. The quiet, bookish man who had never attracted much attention. He had always been in the background, a secondary figure in the family drama. But Miss Marple knew there was something about his presence, his demeanour, that had never quite sat right with her. "Yes," Clara whispered, her voice shaky. He had everything planned. The murder of Charles, he orchestrated it all. He knew Judith had found out, and he couldn't afford to let her ruin his plans, but he didn't want anyone to suspect him, not directly. He used Roger to carry out his dirty work and to manipulate me, but it was always him. Always Julian. A silence enveloped the room. Roger's earlier defiance had evaporated, leaving behind only an empty shell of a man. He said nothing now, merely standing motionless, as though the truth had taken whatever energy remained within him. Miss Marple's mind was in overdrive. Julian Collingwood, the quiet heir to the Collingwood estate. He had been planning this for years, using everyone around him as tools in his quest for control. First, Charles had to go, then Judith, who would have stopped him. He had hidden in plain sight, casting suspicion on others, letting them take the fall while he pulled the strings from behind the scenes. It was all so perfectly calculated, so cold. Turning to Quinn, Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "You must go to the estate now," she said, her voice firm. "We can't waste any more time. Julian is still out there, and he has far too much to lose." Quinn hesitated, still processing the magnitude of the revelation. "But he's been living among us. If we didn't know it was him, how could we—" "Because," Miss Marple interrupted, her voice steady and sure, "he's been playing a game all along. The moment you start to look at the things he didn't want you to see, you'll understand. Julian has hidden himself behind layers of lies, just as he always does. But now that we know the truth, we can expose him." Before Quinn could respond, Miss Marple turned to face Roger one last time. "This isn't over, Roger," she said, her tone calm, though her eyes were hard. "You've made your confession, but you are not the one who has been running this show. Julian Collingwood is the one who truly needs to answer for what's happened here, and if you've been as much a victim as you say, then you will have to live with the consequences of your actions as well." Roger's face contorted with a mixture of anger and shame, but he said nothing more. Miss Marple didn't need to hear him speak. She had the answers now. The pieces had fallen into place. It wasn't just about the murders. It was about power, control, and a long-buried greed that had finally come to light. But even as the truth took shape, Miss Marple felt a subtle, unsettling sense of unfinished business lingering in the air. There was no way to know for certain if Julian Collingwood would be brought to justice. He was clever, calculating. He had planned for every possibility. Perhaps even now he was watching them, preparing his escape. Miss Marple sighed, and with that, the game would continue. Justice had been served, for some. But for Julian, the chase was far from over. The night was falling, casting long shadows over the Collingwood estate, as Miss Marple stepped out of the grand entrance, her mind still sharp, yet full of lingering thoughts. The events of the past few days had come to a conclusion, but something about the resolution felt incomplete. The momentary satisfaction of solving the case was overshadowed by the unease that had settled in her chest, like a heavy weight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the distant sound of the sea crashing against the cliffs echoed through the evening. Quinn had left for the estate, determined to find Julian before he could disappear into the night. The authorities were closing in, but Miss Marple knew better than anyone that in the world of crime, certainty was a fleeting thing. She had seen too many cases where the answers were never fully given, where the shadows of the past lingered, feeding the darkness that waited just beyond the horizon. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the driveway, her gaze fixed on the horizon. There was a chill in the air, a whisper of something yet to come. She had solved the murders, untangled the web of deceit that had ensnared the Collingwood family, but there was still something that gnawed at her. Julian Collingwood was clever, too clever to be caught off guard. Even if they found him now, there would be other games, other secrets waiting to emerge from the corners of the world, and there was something else, something small, almost insignificant. But it had been bothering her since the beginning, a single detail that had been overlooked in the rush to uncover the truth, a detail that until now had seemed irrelevant, like a piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. But now it seemed to pulse in the back of her mind, the rhythm of an unanswered question. Miss Marple turned back to the house, her footsteps light but deliberate. As she walked up the marble steps to the grand entrance, the faintest of sounds reached her ears, the softest click of a door closing. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Someone was still in the house. She glanced toward the shadows, where the lights from the mansion barely touched. For a moment, she hesitated. The case felt done. The criminals had been caught. Justice had been served. And yet, she stepped forward slowly, her movements purposeful, as she made her way back inside. The silence inside the mansion was almost oppressive, the air thick with the heavy weight of a past that refused to be forgotten. As Miss Marple moved deeper into the house, her sharp eyes scanned every inch of the dimly lit hallway. There was something odd about the atmosphere, an unnatural stillness that made her skin prickle. Reaching the library, she paused, her eyes narrowing as she saw a shadow shift behind the curtains. There was someone still there. Without a word, she stepped into the room, her steps light but certain. The figure behind the curtains froze, and for a moment there was a tension so palpable that Miss Marple could feel it in the air, like a taut string waiting to snap. The figure hesitated, then slowly pulled the curtain aside. It was a man, thin, with sharp features, and eyes that glinted with a strange mix of fear and something more dangerous. He was holding something in his hand, something that Miss Marple couldn't make out in the low light. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, as if he were trying to hide something beneath the surface. I was wondering when you would arrive." She didn't answer immediately. She only watched him closely, her mind piecing together the fragments of the case in a quiet, methodical manner. Julian Collingwood was gone, or so they had believed. But now, standing before her in the shadows of the Collingwood mansion, was someone who should not have been there. The puzzle pieces fell into place with unsettling clarity. "I'm afraid you've been expecting me," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but unwavering. "But the question remains, why?" The man didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Because you're always looking for the truth, aren't you? Always searching for the answers. But the truth, Miss Marple, is a dangerous thing to seek." He moved toward her, and for the first time, Miss Marple saw the object in his hand, a small, folded envelope. Her instinct screamed at her to be cautious, but her gaze never left him. "Careful," she said, her voice calm but edged with authority. "What is it that you're hiding?" The man hesitated, his grip on the envelope tightening. Then, with a sudden movement, he thrust it toward her. "A little something for your troubles," he said, his words dripping with an unsettling calmness. "Miss." Marple took the envelope from him, her fingers brushing against the paper. As she unfolded it, a single piece of paper slipped out, its message written in a hurried scrawl. She read the cryptic words quickly. "You've only scratched the surface. There's more to this than you know. Follow the thread, and you'll find the truth. But beware. Some things are better left in the dark." She looked up, but the man had already turned and was slipping into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Miss Marple stood there for a moment, holding the note in her hand, her thoughts racing. The note made little sense, yet everything about it felt ominous. There was something unfinished, something lurking just beyond the scope of the case she had solved. Julian Collingwood had been just the beginning, a player in a much larger game. And now, it seemed, the game was far from over. The man had vanished, leaving her with only questions. But Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. This was not the end. It couldn't be. There was another mystery, another case waiting to unfold, and though it wasn't clear yet, she could feel it in the air like a storm on the horizon. With the envelope still in her hand, Miss Marple turned and walked back toward the door. The mansion once again felt empty, but the weight of the unknown pressed in around her. There were more pieces to find, more truths to uncover. The hunt was far from finished, and as the night settled in, Miss Marple's mind was already working, already anticipating the next move in a game that would never truly end.